you set foot in the deep wild forest of Scandinavia, be on your guard. You might hear her singing or laughing, a young, beautiful maiden who's herding her cows. Be careful not to disrespect her, and above all, don't tell her your name. Hi, my name is Josie and I'm an illustrator and I'm from Sweden. I have a massive interest in folklore and folk creatures from all over the world, but because I'm specifically from Sweden, that's a good place to begin. So today I thought I would talk a little bit about a creature that goes by many names. I think internationally she's best known as Huldra, which is the Norwegian name for this creature. But obviously, like with a lot of these kind of natural creatures of or spirits of nature, there exist multiple versions across many different cultures. So let me know in the comments if you have a creature similar to this in your country. So this creature has a very important role in Scandinavian folklore. And that's Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. And we all have different names for this creature, but I know that there also are versions of this creature in Finland, Germany, and Russia, for obvious reasons. And probably, very likely, there are versions in other parts of Europe as well. Like I said, I'm from Sweden, so I'm going to mostly talk about our versions. First things first, the creature, like the version of this creature that I've been familiar with since childhood, is named Skogsrået, which is a combination of the word skog, meaning forest, and rå, meaning to rule over, to reign over, someone who reigns over something or rules over something. So Skogsrået basically means she who dwells in the forest, she who reigns over or cares for the forest and its creatures. Obviously, depending on the different regions in Sweden, she will have different nicknames, but I think the kind of collective name for this character that most are familiar with in Sweden is specifically Skogsrået. Some other names that I found as an example were Grankotte-Kari, which is, Kari is a name, and Grankotte means pine cone. Talle-Maja, so like pine tree, Maja, which is a name, mistress over the forest, and Bestan, so like she-beast. And those are just a few. I found many more different names of this creature that I hadn't heard of. Where I come from, I'm from the north of Sweden. I'm from Umeå in the Västerbotten region. It's technically part of Sápmi, which is part of Sami land, our kind of indigenous people. And there are variations from that culture that has also seeped into the local belief system as well. While Skogsrået is a creature that sort of roams on her own, it's just her with her animals, she sort of belongs to this group of creatures who tend to different aspects of nature. And Skogsrået is mostly known to be a female figure. In some variations, especially in the north and specifically coming from Sami culture, the character will also be male in some examples. So the version of this character that I grew up with was generally known to be a beautiful woman, long, often blonde hair, sometimes naked. I think in my mind I imagine her as a naked young woman who roams the forest. Sometimes with some animal features, maybe she would have some fur or hoofed feet, at least one animal feature, like one animal leg. And her main thing is kind of being seductive to people who visit her domain. And, you know, depending on your interaction with her, she can either reward you or punish you. Obviously, when I had the idea to make this video, I decided to do some research, and luckily I work in a library, so getting resources was fairly easy, and I found a lot of different variations that I was completely unaware of. In one version, she isn't actually a beautiful young woman, that's just like a mirage, and underneath all of that she's an ugly old lady, because of course she is, and supposedly she has hands so huge she can use them to rake leaves on the forest floor. Sometimes she has a cow's tail, and sometimes she has a fox's tail. Sometimes she's beautiful from the front, and then her back looks like a rotten, hollowed out tree, which was an image I really enjoyed, and I would like to draw a version of that. Sometimes she's beautifully dressed, and sometimes the clothes that she wears can signify different things. So if she's wearing something dark, that's a bad omen. And if she's wearing white, something that looks like a wedding gown, that can be a positive sign. Mostly this character roams the forest and is a guardian of it. In some stories, she is herding her cows, and I think in Värmland, which is another region in Sweden, there's like a nursery rhyme of her calling for her cows and calling their names. You can hear her evil laughter ringing through the forest, or potentially beautiful singing. And there are different variations of how her powers kind of take shape. So circling back, in my mind, this creature is someone who usually shows herself to a man who is working on his own in the forest. And often it's just to get him to have sex with her. She is there to seduce him. If he complies, she rewards him by making the coal mill produce a more consistent and higher quality coal. If he's a hunter, she might mess with his gun. There's also different stories of her generally playing pranks on people in the forest. In one of the stories that I read, there were two different men that went into the forest to hunt together. And while they were resting, she blew into the end of their gun. And the next day, one of them could not hit a single target, and the other one could only hit a target. There's another kind of more gory or gruesome version of that story of two men going into the forest, one of them being short and the other one being tall, and then her overnight giving them the same height by cutting the taller one down and transferring it to the shorter person. Like a lot of natural spirits and creatures, kind of depended on how you treated her and her animals. She was very protective of her cows, and in some versions she had moose, like riding moose, that she used to travel through the forest. And if you caused them harm, she would harm you in return. So there are different ways to get away from Skogsrået. It's very important if you meet her that you don't tell her your name, because then she gains power over you. I feel like this has some similarities in other fairy tales, specifically like Germanic folk tales. Rumpelstiltskin, you have to guess the name of the creature, or if a creature knows your name, then you're in more danger because your name holds a part of your soul. It's like a signifier that differentiate you, identifies you. But there are other ways to get away from Skogsrået. Skogsrået liked getting presents, specifically salt, tobacco, and little coins, which I hadn't heard before. There's also variations of the story where if you carry garlic, valerian, and a kind of berry that translates to Daphne. I had never heard of this berry before, so I don't think it's a northern occurrence. Mostly in leafy forests and meadows. That makes sense. That would probably be a southern thing. Sometimes also silverware, like silver crosses or silver jewelry. A lump of silver will help you, which obviously is true for a lot of different folklore creatures. Also, steel can have the same function as silver. But the version that I had heard of the most is to turn your clothes inside out and do everything in reverse. That way you will be free of this creature and her power. So just to get an idea of this creature, I'm going to read just a short story. And it's written in Swedish, so I'm just translating it quickly. I'm trying to read it as smoothly as possible. Let's cross our fingers. The story is about a young man who worked in the coal mill, would lie awake alone at night in a small hut, longing for his wife and his children back home. One evening, a beautiful woman entered into the hut. The man sat up and asked politely if she wanted some coffee. The woman didn't answer, but sat quietly next to him. There was no question of what she wanted. The young man could not resist her seductive glances. It was as if she had enchanted him. Finally, he relented and let her sleep with him. After, as she was fixing her skirts, he caught sight of her tail. He understood then who she was, and grew cold with fear. The next night she came back, and several nights after that. The work at the coal mill just improved every day. Never before had it given such a nice quality of wooden coal. When the work at the coal mill was finished, the man returned home, and immediately the wife noticed that something was different with her husband. He avoided her gaze, spoke with few words. Every night he disappeared into the woods and didn't return until dawn. For every day he grew skinnier, paler, and quieter. The wife understood that it was Skogsrået. So one morning she walked out and called for Skogsrået until she appeared. The wife asked, "We have a bull on our farm who isn't keeping to our own cow, but escapes and fraternizes with the neighbor's cows. Do you know a cure for this?" Skogsrået laughed loudly and said, "Yes, I do. You should give the bull garlic, daphne, and valerian to eat, and he will remain home with his own cow." Of course, the clever wife didn't give the cure to the bull, but to her own man. And just like that, Skogsrõd's power over him was broken. The author who wrote the version that I'm reading finishes the story with, "I've heard this story from several people, so most likely it is true. It has also been written down by Swedish author Selma Lagerlöf, who wrote about it in her book Gösta Berling's Saga, and a Nobel Prize winner you can always trust. When I decided that I wanted to do a video on this topic, obviously started reading a little bit about it, and like I mentioned, I work in a library, so I had pretty decent access to a couple of books. Funnily enough, most of them aimed at children, which I think is interesting. But I just have to show you the illustrations from this particular book. So the book is written by Ingela Korsell, and the illustrator is named Rainer Rosenberg. I would highly recommend checking out his work because it's really... and he does like unsettling illustrations really well. I think it's interesting because as I was reading up on this, it turns out that there's also versions of this character who is mentioned in Norse mythology. Specifically, Skogsrået had like a feud with Odin in one specific mythological tale, which I hadn't heard of. I kind of assumed that the both were separate. But obviously these creatures kind of lived alongside each other. There's the kind of, I guess, faith-based mythological aspects, these gods, these deities that represent different forces of the world, and then these kind of lower tier creatures who are representations of specific aspects of nature or dangers, I guess. And like with a lot of things in other parts of the world as well, with the influence of Christianity and the spread of Christianity, these kind of originally morally grey creatures who are neither good or bad, they kind of become versions or helpers to forces of evil. I don't actually know how to translate this word. I know what it is. It comes up a lot in these stories. And when I try to translate that, it shows up as coal mill, which makes sense because it's a place where you produce coal. But it's like a very specific and has been a very important job up in the north. It's usually undertaken by very few people, like either a very small group of men, or it's been shifts of like one man at a time working on these coal mills, felling trees and keeping, the fire burning in order to produce coal that can be shipped off or used, in the community. And they usually take a very specific shape, in my mind, from the region, the part of the country where I'm from. I think Sweden is very much associated with forests. That is true, there's forests in most of Sweden. Not a lot in the south, where I'm currently living, like the southern third, much less forest than up north. So it would make sense that I have this association of this creature showing up to the men working this very specific job that was very important. There's obviously, like, culturally, this kind of understanding of usually men having to go out in the forest and doing work, either if it's working with felling trees and the forestry aspect, or producing coal or shipping wood downstream, is kind of seeped into, you just have this knowledge because you've heard stories of, your grandparents' generation and stuff like that. So it's just something that you're aware of, especially growing up in the part of the country that is probably most known for its forests. There's a lot of widespread forest that's sort of like a no man's land. Not really, but like compared to other parts of the country that is more, more urban. Yeah, there's trees, there's groupings of trees, but like the further up north you get, the more widespread these kind of really long distances of uninhabited forest exist. And obviously 150, 200 years ago, that was even less like there were even fewer people living there. And so obviously these areas have been a source of danger for a lot of people. And because it was important for the local economy, or even like the individual little family, not having connection to a bigger community or a city or, safety in that regard, these creatures obviously became like a symbol for that danger, invoking the kind of respect that you need to survive out there. So a very clear sign that someone had been interacting with Skogsrået was that he became more quiet, spoke less, avoided eye contact and things like that. It's really interesting looking at these kinds of stories with a modern lens. As I was reading up on this, I found some examples of researchers talking about this phenomena. And, it's not that difficult to imagine. You're living in a very small, isolated part of the world, maybe part of a village or a community that is still pretty widespread. You're not necessarily living close to one another. It might be a few hours to the next farm or neighbor, maybe you're meeting your community at church once a week, and that's like the most of it. Maybe you trade some goods and stuff like that, but it's a very isolated existence. And then on top of that, you're just one person going out into the wilderness on your own with the pressure to provide for your family, and where your whole livelihood and survival and your family, your children's survival is depending on how well you do in the forest. So you're living out there on your own, maybe taking turns with one or two other men, but mostly conducting this work alone in the dead of the forest. And it's dark and it's cold because it's Sweden. And there's all these different things, There's wild animals, lynxes or bears or wolves that are roaming free. Even moose are incredibly dangerous creatures. You're surrounded by this wilderness that is unfamiliar and strange. And, maybe you're even starving a little bit. Maybe you shoot an animal, but maybe you do something wrong in the process of butchering and the meat goes off. There's all these different things that can have a very huge impact on your mental health. Not just the stakes or the pressure or the stress or the loneliness or the cold or, probably lack of comfortable sleep. And I can absolutely imagine that spending months at a time in that kind of situation would cause you to, imagine things, or experiencing things alters your personality. And then you return to your family and your community. Suddenly you're forced to interact with people in a way that you haven't done for several months. And maybe your children have grown a little bit and you don't recognize them. You can't relate to them anymore. The warmth of the home and the softness of the bed and these social interactions that you haven't really had for a really long time. And of course you're going to appear very different. You might be dirty. Maybe you've lost weight out in the woods. There's all these different aspects. And I think, as much as I really love folklore and I love the kind of idea of maybe these creatures exist, maybe we've just driven them deeper into the nature, maybe you will meet them when you visit the forest, because the forest is such an alluring place. There's no question that there is something special about nature. It has its own magic. But I also am really interested in the psychological aspect of these creatures and what it has meant to the individual who doesn't have, modern science at his or her disposal. It's things that we can't relate to today, and it's what makes history such a fascinating thing to look at. One of the things I read in preparation for this that I can't find a source for now, and I can't even find where I read it, but claimed that it was still punishable in Sweden in the late 19th century if you showed signs of having interacted with Skogsrået. I'm not sure that's true. It's very possible that was true. There was a report with different cases and they all dated to late 18th century, so I'm not sure that it's true. However, I do know that people did talk about these creatures up until my dad was a child. Whether people actually believed in them or they were used in a symbolic way, not sure, but it's very much been a living part of culture up until pretty recently. I thought it was really interesting because being aware of this creature in the collective unconscious, the cultural unconscious here, not really knowing the specifics, just knowing that, if you go into the woods, there's the Vitra and Näcken and Bäckahäst and all these different creatures who, in one way or another, you should stay clear of, who can cause you harm, cause you to walk into a lake or drown in a river or just get lost or, lose your mind or your spirit. And it's really interesting to read about the different versions because obviously it's mostly a way to understand and respect, I guess, the world around you. Today we have all these different tools that help us, and there's not a lot of uninhabited or unknown land anymore that we are unfamiliar with. We have machines and computers and all these different things that help us, I guess, in one way or another, conquer nature. But that wasn't the case back then. And I want to finish on a really sweet thing that Ingela Korsell wrote in this specific book where I read the story from. She talks about how stories about Skogsrået were used as a way to explain why some were successful and some failed with their work in the forest. Why some were lucky in their hunt and some weren't. You know, those kinds of things were really important to people for obvious reasons. It was their whole livelihood. And it could be absolutely, you know, detrimental to their general survival if they didn't succeed. The function of Skogsrået was also a reminder that people should treat the forest's animals and plants with respect and reverence. Not to take too much from the forest, since it should be shared by children, grandchildren, and grandchildren's children in the future. Something we should be reminded by and get better at in today's society. So I was going to show you some footage of me making an illustration based on this, but I don't think it fits into this video. I don't want to distract from just the cool stories of this creature. So maybe I will make a video of just the process of kind of adapting some of these stories into an illustration. Maybe I can talk about the process, like the creative process of making an illustration. This was probably a very long video, and if you stuck around to the end, thank you so much. I hope it was coherent. I would very much like to make more videos like this. This is a huge area of interest for me, and there's plenty of more creatures just from Sweden to discuss. It does take some research. I want to make sure that I'm telling it correctly, and I want to make sure that I have some literature to refer to, even though, you know, these kinds of stories are more word of mouth than, you know, written down. And there's a million different variations on every single aspect and story, which makes it more interesting and more difficult. So trying to keep it concise. If there's any questions or anything that I was unclear about, you know, the better you know something, the harder it is to talk about it sometimes, especially when there's a translation issue. Yeah, tell me your favorite folklore creatures, anything that you maybe might want to hear about in the future. Hopefully I did the topic justice. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and I hope to see you back here soon. Take care.